The final sermon in the sermon series on Sabbath from May 2024 is from the 4th chapter of the book of Hebrews. So listen for the word of the Lord. So you see that Sabbath rest is left open for God's people. The one who entered God's rest also rested from his works, just as God rested from his own. Therefore, let's make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall by following the same example of disobedience. So friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, if you haven't watched any of the other sermons in this 4-part series, here's where we've come in this series on Sabbath. Genesis showed us that because God rested on the 7th day of creation, Sabbath is rest. Exodus reminded us of the exile in Egypt, where the Israelites could not worship their own God because they didn't have time to rest, nor were they allowed to worship any other god than what the Egyptians worshipped. So that brought us to rest plus worship equals Sabbath. Then we looked at Mark and learned that we can't know rest unless we also know work. So Sabbath is intended for renewal, but without knowing the drive of work, we don't know the restoration of Sabbath. And so here we are, getting ready to finish out the series on Sabbath by looking at the book of Hebrews. And I can read your thoughts. I know you're thinking, yeah, Sabbath and rest and going to church, but the lawn isn't going to mow itself, and I haven't cleaned the bathroom in 2 weeks, and my department is understaffed at work, and I'm just busy. I will rest when I'm dead. And I'm sure if you haven't said that expression that you've at least heard it. And there have been movies and songs called I'll Rest When I'm Dead. And Madonna, not the mother of Jesus, but the pop singer, is even quoted as saying, I'll rest when I'm dead, I'm hungry, and life is short. So, eternal rest, eternal slumber, R.I.P., rest in peace. Whether we know it or not, we already think of rest, sleep, peace when we think of death and the afterlife. If we're at a funeral service and there is an open casket, we know the funeral directors have done their very best to ensure the person looks like they're sleeping peacefully. Eyes closed, hands folded. It's always sad. It's a little bit grim, but it's always peaceful. Now, I don't think heaven is going to look like pearly gates or a flowery garden or anything like these pop culture images would have us believe. I think it's going to look like an eternal Sabbath. So let's dive into that. Okay, the author of Hebrews is unknown, and it was written 50, 60, 70 years or so after Jesus' resurrection. Now, it is not entirely clear exactly who the intended audience was, but it was likely written, and scholars can tell this by the way it was written, it was likely written for a specific group of predominantly Jewish Christians. So we can tell by the way Hebrews was written that this group was feeling discouraged because they were probably suffering to some extent and really were sitting around and doubting whether Jesus really forgives sin. So the whole focus of the book is on Christ being superior to everything else. The law, the angels, prophets, the priests. And because Christ is superior to everything else, people can have absolute confidence in Jesus. And so in the beginning of the chapter I just read, the writer acknowledges that it is not enough to intellectually know or understand that Jesus is everything. We must also receive it, believe it with faith. And if we believe, we can be certain that we will experience that state of resting. Pause. This rest that the writer of Hebrews is talking about here, I want to be clear that it doesn't mean a good night's sleep. It doesn't mean a superior afternoon nap on the couch, though all of that is great though, right? This rest is the heavenly blessedness in which God dwells. It's heaven. It's eternal, continual, ongoing Sabbath. It's a return to how we were created to be before sin came into the world. And if you watched the Genesis sermon, we talked about how humankind was not created to toil endlessly. Instead, we were in fact created to Sabbath. And it was sin that brought hard labor into the world and messed the whole thing up. So the book of Revelation tells us that heaven, eternity, is where we will worship non-stop. So it is an ongoing Sabbath. In Hebrews, God keeps renewing this promise of eternal rest, saying that the promise is still live today, which means every day, all the days. The promise of arrival and rest is still there for God's people, even for those who are disobedient, if they change their ways. They can always claim their spot in this eternal Sabbath. Listen to this part. God is at rest. And at the end of the journey, we will surely rest with God. So let's keep at it and eventually arrive at the place of rest, not drop out through some sort of disobedience. So that's eternal Sabbath, eternal rest. But here's the thing. When we Sabbath here on earth, today, this week, whenever you choose, whichever day you choose, it's a foretaste of how it will be when God's way is fully established. Now, that's not to say that there will be church pews and a preacher or recliners and bad TV in heaven. Those are human things, tools, if you will, that aid us in Sabbathing here on earth. But there's a reason why there are books on Sabbath called Subversive Sabbath and Sabbath as Resistance. This is a revolutionary idea. Well, maybe it's not so revolutionary since it's existed since the dawn of creation, but carving a day out each week to both spend time with God and to spend time resting, that is revolutionary in a society that is focused on time management and deadlines and productivity and benchmarks. When we spend time in Sabbath, we are reminded how God intended for creation to be from the start. We are reminded of the idea of community and God's kingdom and how God intends for us to care for one another and for ourselves. We are reminded of how it will be on the other side of this life for those who believe. So when we Sabbath, we are reclaiming our time, taking time in God's name, which is no small witness to a world deluded into thinking that time is its own. Our time is a gift from God. And we are therefore accountable to God for how we spend our time. So when we want to measure time and deadlines and productivity and benchmarks, we actually measure it by God's standards, not by the world's standards. Do you now see how subversive this really is? So while I'm away on a sabbatical this summer, I really encourage you to get a copy of the book Subversive Sabbath by A.J. Swoboda and read it with me. I'll put a link to the book in the description box. Personally, I'm really excited to learn how the idea of Sabbath is subversive, because I really want to change my mind on how I measure my own time. And I want to restructure my life when I return from sabbatical to get it closer to and more reflective of God. Even though the world is hectic, even though there are demands on our time that can fill up our schedules and cause us to have super busy days, even though our culture tells us we must be productive at all hours of the day, we are not accountable to the world. We are not accountable to our schedules. We are not even accountable to American culture. We are created by God. We belong to God. So we are accountable to God first and foremost. So here's what you should do. Go out and work this summer. Get done what you need to get done during the week. Be busy, do all the appointments, make all the things, do all the things in your schedule. But really do take that one day to rest plus worship equals Sabbath. Just as eternity will be a continual Sabbath. Keeping Sabbath during our week, every week, is a foretaste and an anticipation of how it will be when God's way is fully established. So let us practice Sabbath here on earth every single week. Amen. And I'll see you in September.